The iron bar was a cold, unforgiving weight in Elias Thorne's hands. He grunted, shifting his footing on the packed earth, his breath pluming white in the late autumn air. The granite block, a monster of gray and quartz weighing easily 500 pounds, resisted. It was the cornerstone, the first deliberate act in a long argument he was having with the world. He leaned his entire body into the lever, muscles in his back and shoulders screaming a tight, hot protest. The stone scraped, groaned, and then settled with a deep, final thud into the trench he had spent a week digging. It was perfect. Level. Square to the lines he had staked. He stood up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a raw-knuckled hand, and surveyed the single stone sitting in the raw cut of the prairie. A shadow fell over him. Not from a cloud, but from the patient, silent form of his dog. Boro, a great shaggy beast of indeterminate lineage, sat with his head cocked, his intelligent amber eyes fixed on the stone. He offered a low, questioning whine. Elias reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, the rough fur of familiar comfort. "It's the first one, boy," he murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. "Only 300 more like it." Boro seemed to accept this, his tail giving 2 slow, deliberate thumps against the frozen ground. He was the only one who didn't look at Elias as if he were mad. Elias had lost his parents to the fever 2 years prior, leaving him at 19 with a quarter section of unforgiving Dakota land and his father's leather-bound journal. The journal was not filled with memories or philosophies, but with strange, meticulous diagrams of structures Elias had never seen. There were cross-sections of walls 4 feet thick, designs for baffled chimneys that curled like a snail's shell, and calculations for roof pitches so low they were nearly flat. His father, a quiet engineer from the old country, had been obsessed with one thing: the wind. He had studied it, measured it, and filled pages with theories on how to defeat it, not with strength, but with geometry. Now, Elias was building his father's final, most ambitious design. A house dug into the south-facing slope of a low hill, built of stone and sod, a fortress against the sky itself. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen." The voice belonged to Mr. Abernathy, his nearest neighbor, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard-won experience. He stood at the edge of Elias's property, his hands on his hips, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Son, you're building a cellar, not a house. Where are the windows? How's a roof that low gonna shed the snow?" Elias picked up his trowel, not meeting the older man's gaze. He ran a hand over the cool, rough surface of the cornerstone. "It's for the wind," he said, the words simple and direct. Abernathy let out a short, humorless laugh. "The wind? We all deal with the wind, boy. We build tall and strong with steep roofs. That's how it's done. You're just inviting the drifts to bury you alive." He shook his head, a gesture of finality. "Wait until winter. You'll learn." Elias didn't reply. He had no words that would convince a man like Abernathy. His father's journal was full of warnings against conventional wisdom, against the tall, proud wooden structures that dotted the prairie. "They fight the wind," his father had written in his precise, angular script. "They stand up and challenge it. The wind always wins a challenge." Elias scooped a heavy dollop of mortar onto the stone. His proof would not be in argument. It would be in the stone, in the sod, in the silence when the world outside was screaming. He set the second stone, its weight a promise. Boro lay down near the foundation, his chin on his paws, a silent, furry witness to the slow, stubborn work. The wind picked up, a low moan across the endless grass, as if it were already testing the single defiant course of rock. It was a language Elias was beginning to understand. The days bled into weeks, each one a cycle of back-breaking labor. Elias rose before the sun, the cold air a shock to his lungs, and worked until the last vestiges of daylight failed him. He and Boro had made a camp near the quarry he'd opened on the far side of the hill, a simple lean-to against a rock face. Every morning began with the ring of a sledgehammer against a steel wedge, splitting the granite along its natural fissures. He learned the stone's language, the subtle lines that promised a clean break, the dull thud that warned of a shatter. He hauled the dressed blocks on a stone boat, a heavy wooden sledge pulled by his two long-suffering oxen, their breath misting in the air as they strained against the immense weight. Each trip was a slow, grinding pilgrimage from the quarry to the building site, a distance of less than a quarter mile that felt like a journey across a continent. His hands, once merely calloused, became maps of his effort. They were perpetually bruised, scraped, and swollen. At night, by the light of a flickering lantern, he would pick splinters from his palms and rub tallow into the cracks in his skin. He ate sparingly, hardtack, dried meat, and the occasional rabbit Boro managed to catch. The physical toll was immense, a constant deep ache in his bones that sleep never fully erased. Yet there was a purity in the exhaustion. His grief for his parents, a sharp and constant thing, began to dull, replaced by the immediate, overwhelming reality of stone and mortar. The work was a meditation. Levering a 1,000-pound lintel into place required absolute focus. Setting a course of wall stones demanded a patience that bordered on prayer. He was not just building a house, he was building a new foundation for his own life, one heavy block at a time. The structure grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, from the earth. It did not rise so much as it thickened. The walls were a full 4 feet thick, 2 outer layers of interlocking stone with a rubble-fill core. It was a method from his father's journal, one that created immense thermal mass. As the walls crept upward, the community's skepticism hardened into a kind of morbid fascination. Mr. Davies, the town's land speculator and wealthiest citizen, would often ride out on his fine bay mare to observe the spectacle. He was in the process of erecting a magnificent 2-story Victorian house on the highest point in town, a testament to his prosperity, all white paint, intricate gingerbread trim, and soaring roof lines. He saw Elias's project as a personal affront to progress. "Thorne," he'd call out, not bothering to dismount. "My man can put up a whole wall of clapboard in the time it takes you to set 3 stones. What's the point of living like a badger in a burrow when civilization has given us the sawmill?" Elias would simply nod, adjusting a stone with a tap of his hammer. "I have a plan," he would say, the same quiet, unadorned response he gave to everyone. "A plan for what? To be forgotten by the sun?" Davies would sneer, then ride off, leaving Elias in a cloud of dust and derision. The name for his project was born from these visits, Elias's Folly. It started as a joke, but it stuck. Mrs. Gable, a kind woman whose farm bordered his to the east, was a different kind of skeptic. Her doubt was laced with genuine concern. She would bring him fresh bread and jars of preserves, her eyes full of worry as she took in his gaunt frame and ragged clothes. "Elias, dear," she'd say, her voice soft, "it's not right for a boy to be living like this. There's a room for you in town. Mr. Abernathy would give you good work. This is too much for one person." "I'm fine, Mrs. Gable. Thank you for the bread." "But the winter," she'd insist, pulling her shawl tighter. "A winter on this prairie isn't a joke. It's a killer. That thing won't be warm. It's a stone box. It'll be a tomb." It was during one of Mrs. Gable's visits that he first truly noticed her daughter, Clara. She often came with her mother, a quiet girl with observant blue eyes and a way of standing just on the edge of the conversation. While her mother fretted, Clara watched. She didn't look at the bizarre structure with scorn or pity. She looked at it with an intense, analytical curiosity. She watched how he used the leverage of the iron bar, how he tested each stone for stability before applying mortar, how he sighted down the wall to ensure it was true. One afternoon, she lingered after her mother left. She stood for a long moment, simply watching him work. Boro, who was wary of most strangers, went and sat near her, resting his head on his paws. "Why is the door so low?" she asked. Her voice was clear and direct, without judgment. Elias stopped, surprised. It was the first question he'd been asked about the how instead of the why. He pointed with his trowel to the recessed entryway, a short tunnel leading to the thick wooden door. "It's a wind trap," he explained. "The wind can't hit the door directly. It has to go in, get confused, and lose its power." She nodded, considering this. "And the chimney?" She pointed to the strange, squat structure of stone on the roof, barely 3 feet high. "Won't the smoke just blow back down?" "It's baffled inside," he said, finding himself wanting to explain it to her. He sketched a spiral in the dirt with a piece of stone. "The smoke has to travel in a spiral to get out. The wind can blow over the top, but it can't blow down the spiral. It creates a steady draw, no matter how hard the wind blows." Clara looked from the sketch to the chimney, then back to Elias. A small, slow smile touched her lips. "That's clever," she said. "That's very clever." It was perhaps the first word of praise he had received in months. It felt heavier, more solid than any stone he had yet lifted. He found himself smiling back, a rusty, unfamiliar feeling. "It'll work," he said. And for the first time, the words felt less like a defense and more like a simple statement of fact. From then on, Clara's visits became more frequent. Sometimes she came with her mother, sometimes alone, bringing a canteen of fresh water or a piece of apple cake. They didn't talk much. She would sit on a finished section of the wall, Boro's head in her lap, and watch him work. Her silent presence was a balm, a quiet counterpoint to the town's loud chorus of doubt. She was, like Boro, a believer. And for Elias, that was enough. By mid-November, the folly was complete. It was a strange and alien sight on the prairie. From the north, it was almost invisible, just a gentle, grass-covered mound rising from the hillside. From the south, it presented a low, formidable face of gray granite, with 2 small, deep-set windows and the sunken, protected doorway. The roof, made of thick wooden beams, was covered in layers of tar paper, then a foot of packed earth, and finally, the same tough prairie sod he had carefully removed from the foundation, which was now knitting itself back together. It looked less like a house and more like a feature of the landscape, something that had grown there rather than been built. He moved his few possessions inside, his parents' bed, a simple wooden table and 2 chairs, and a cast-iron stove. The interior was a single large room, the stone walls left bare. It was dark, save for the light from the 2 southern windows and the fire he lit in the stove. The baffled chimney worked exactly as his father's diagrams had predicted. It drew beautifully, pulling the smoke up and away while a steady, silent warmth began to fill the room. The air was still, utterly, profoundly still. Outside, the eternal prairie wind soughed and moaned, but inside, there was only the crackle of the fire and the quiet sound of his own breathing. Boro circled the room, sniffing every corner, before settling on the hearthrug with a contented sigh. Elias ran a hand over the cold, solid stone of the wall. This was his home. He had done it. The first snows of December were light, a dusting of white that outlined the world in stark relief. The townspeople took it as a final, amusing touch. "Look at that," Mr. Abernathy was heard to say at the general store. "The boy's built himself a grave and the good lords provided the shroud." The laughter was easy and confident. The winter, they all knew, was the final arbiter, and it was coming. January of 1888 began with an unnerving mildness. The sky was a pale, hazy blue, and the temperatures were warm enough to melt the light snow, turning the landscape to a brown, muddy slush. The old-timers grew uneasy. They watched the cattle, who were restless and huddled together despite the warmth. They watched the sky, which had a strange, yellowish tint to it. "Feels wrong," Abernathy muttered to anyone who would listen. "This is weather building up a head of steam. Something's coming." On the morning of January 12th, Elias woke to an eerie silence. The wind, his constant companion, had vanished. The air was heavy, still, and unnaturally warm. Burro stood at the door, a low growl rumbling in his chest, the fur on his back ridged. Elias opened the thick plank door and looked out. The sky to the northwest was no longer blue. It was a churning, bruised wall of gray-black that was moving toward them with terrifying speed. He had seen storms before, but this was different. This was a presence, a living, breathing entity of immense power. He didn't hesitate. He brought the oxen into their small, stone-walled lean-to on the east side of the house, checked that the woodpile inside was stacked to the ceiling, and filled every bucket he owned with water from the well. He bolted the door from the inside with a heavy iron bar, then went to one of the small windows. The storm hit not as a progression, but as a single, cataclysmic event. One moment, there was calm. The next, the world dissolved into a blinding, horizontal chaos of white. The temperature plummeted as if a switch had been thrown, dropping dozens of degrees in minutes. A sound began, a high, demonic shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. It was the wind his father had written about, the wind that always wins. Inside the stone house, the change was dramatic but not terrifying. The light from the windows vanished, plunging the room into a deep twilight lit only by the fire. The temperature inside held steady. The shrieking of the wind was a distant, muffled roar, the sound of a faraway ocean. There were no rattles, no drafts, no groans of straining wood. The thick stone walls absorbed the sound and the fury, creating an island of profound calm in the heart of the maelstrom. The baffled chimney performed its miracle, the fire burning as cleanly and steadily as it had on the calmest day. Burro, after his initial alarm, had settled again by the fire, seemingly untroubled. Elias added another log to the stove and sat at the table listening. He was not afraid. He was witnessing the validation of every hour of labor, every callus, every jeer. His father had been right. He spent the day in a state of quiet watchfulness. He ate, checked on the oxen, and listened to the storm. As night fell, the sound outside deepened, becoming a solid, grinding roar. The snow, fine as sugar, was being driven with the force of a sandblaster. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that anyone caught outside was already dead. He thought of the tall, proud houses in town, their windows rattling, their frames groaning under the impossible strain. He thought of Mr. Davies' grand Victorian folly, standing on its hill like a ship in a hurricane. Sometime late in the night, over the dull roar of the storm, he heard a new sound, a frantic, desperate pounding on the door. Burro shot to his feet, barking furiously. Elias calmed the dog with a hand on his head, then slid back the heavy bolt and pulled the door inward. A blast of ice and snow exploded into the room, and two figures stumbled in, collapsing on the floor. It was Mrs. Gable and Clara, their faces raw and frostbitten, their clothes frozen stiff. "The roof!" Mrs. Gable gasped, her words choked with sobs. "It just came apart. The whole kitchen is gone." Elias said nothing. He barred the door again, then helped the two women to the fire. He wrapped them in thick wool blankets and handed Clara a mug of hot coffee he'd kept on the stove. Clara's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. Her eyes met his, wide with shock and a dawning, profound understanding. "We would have died," she whispered. "Another 10 minutes. We would have died." An hour later, there was more pounding. This time it was the Abernathys. Their barn had collapsed on their house, smashing the western wall. They had fought their way through the whiteout, following their own fence line, a journey of 200 yards that had taken them almost an hour. Mr. Abernathy stood in the middle of Elias's room, his face a mask of disbelief, snow melting from his beard and pooling on the floor. He looked at the solid stone walls, at the steady fire, at the calm, still air. He looked at the Gables, huddled by the warmth. He looked at Elias. The old man's arrogance was gone, stripped away by the storm, leaving only a raw and humbled awe. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He simply shook his head slowly, then went to sit by the fire, a refugee in the very structure he had mocked. Before the night was over, 3 more families had found their way to the folly. The Johnsons, whose sod roof had been peeled away by the wind like a piece of turf. The Millers, a young couple with a baby, whose small cabin had simply been blown off its foundation. Elias's home, his stone box, his tomb, had become an ark. It was filled with the quiet, shivering sounds of 17 people, their lives dependent on the strange wisdom of a dead engineer and the stubborn faith of his son. Elias moved among them, a quiet, reassuring presence, adding wood to the stove, sharing his food, and tending to their frostbite. He never said, "I told you so." He didn't have to. The proof was all around them, in the solid stone walls that held the blizzard at bay. The storm raged for 2 full days and a 3rd night. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by an abstract symphony of wind and cold. Inside the stone house, a new community was forged in the warm, fire-lit darkness. Fear gave way to a shared, numbing exhaustion, and then to a quiet sense of wonder. They were alive. Against all odds, huddled in the one place on the prairie that could withstand the storm's fury, they were alive. When the wind finally began to subside on the morning of the 3rd day, a profound silence fell over the room. Elias unbarred the door. It wouldn't budge. He put his shoulder to it and pushed. It gave way with a scraping groan, revealing a solid wall of snow. He grabbed a shovel and began to dig. It took him nearly an hour to carve a narrow tunnel up to the new surface of the world. He emerged, blinking, into a landscape so transformed it was unrecognizable. The sun was blinding on a world of pure, sculpted white. There were no fences, no roads, no familiar landmarks, only rolling, wind-carved drifts of snow, some as high as the rooftops of the houses they concealed. The air was painfully cold, but utterly still. The silence was absolute. One by one, the others climbed out of the tunnel after him, their faces etched with awe and dread. They stood on the slope beside Elias's sod roof, which was now just a gentle rise in an ocean of snow, the baffled chimney poking through like a periscope. From this vantage point, they could see what was left of their town. Mr. Abernathy's house was a ruin, a splintered mess crushed under the remains of his barn. The Johnson place was gone, only the stone foundation visible. The miller's cabin was nowhere to be seen. And on the highest hill, where Mr. Davies' Victorian mansion had stood as a monument to progress, there was only a pile of white-painted splinters and shattered lumber. It looked as though a giant had swatted it from its foundation. A collective gasp went through the small group of survivors. A search party was formed. They moved slowly, sinking to their waists in the deep powder. The devastation was worse than they could have imagined. They found others, some alive, trapped in collapsed cellars or half-destroyed homes. They found more who were not. The grim procession eventually made its way to the wreckage of the Davies house. They found the family in the cellar, huddled together, frozen solid. They had survived the collapse, but without a fire, the cold had been a patient and merciless executioner. As the survivors gathered that afternoon, a somber, frozen knot of humanity in a dead world, Mr. Abernathy made his way over to Elias. He stopped before the young man, his face haggard. For a long moment he said nothing, the weight of all he had seen and all he had been wrong about pressing down on him. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. He extended a hand, no longer the hand of a condescending elder, but of an equal. "You saved us, son. This folly of yours. You saved us all." Elias looked at the old man's outstretched hand and, after a moment, took it. "It was my father's plan," he said. "It was the only explanation he would ever give." In the weeks that followed, the structure once known as Elias's Folly became the heart of Prairie Ridge. It was the command center for the recovery, the hospital for the frostbitten, and the shelter for the homeless. The name Folly died, replaced by a new one, spoken with reverence: the shelter. When the thaw finally came and the true extent of the devastation was revealed, the town did not despair. They began to rebuild. But they built differently. They came to Elias not as a boy to be pitied, but as a leader to be consulted. He was no orator, no politician. He simply unrolled his father's journals on the wooden table inside the shelter and shared what he knew. He spoke of windbreaks, of planting rows of hardy trees to blunt the force of the wind. He explained the principles of thermal mass, of using the earth itself as an insulator. He showed them the diagrams for the baffled chimney and the recessed doorways. Men like Abernathy, who had once scoffed, now listened with the rapt attention of students. They rebuilt their homes with stone foundations, with lower roof lines, with a grudging respect for the power of the prairie wind. The town of Prairie Ridge rose again, not as a collection of proud, defiant structures, but as a community of humbler, wiser ones, nestled into the landscape rather than perched upon it. The lessons of the Great Blizzard were written into the very architecture of the new town. Elias and Clara were married that spring, in a simple ceremony held on the hill beside the shelter. Their life together was much like the house Elias had built, quiet, solid, and enduring. They had 3 children who grew up playing on the sod roof and listening to the muffled sound of the wind, a sound that for them was not terrifying but comforting, the sound of home. Years passed. The railroad came and the town grew into a city. New styles of architecture came and went, but the old part of town, the part rebuilt after '88, retained its unique character. Its houses hunkered low against the horizon. The shelter itself became a landmark, a living piece of history. Elias never moved. He lived in that stone house for the rest of his life. Boro grew old, his muzzle turning gray, his powerful limbs stiffening. He spent his final years sleeping on the hearthrug, his dreams filled with the twitching chases of his youth. One winter evening, with a blizzard once again howling outside, a pale imitation of the Great One, Boro lifted his head, looked at Elias, and laid it back down on his paws with a soft sigh. He did not lift it again. Elias sat with the dog all night, his hand resting on the still warm flank, the silence in the room deeper than it had ever been. The next day, he buried Boro on the crest of the hill, in a spot overlooking the house, and marked it with a simple, undressed fieldstone. There was no name, just the stone. It was enough. Decades melted away. Elias became an old man, his hands gnarled and arthritic, but his eyes still clear. His hair was as white as the snows he had conquered. He became a local legend, a quiet patriarch who would sit with the town's children by the fire in the shelter and tell them stories. He never spoke of heroism or bravery. He spoke of physics. He spoke of stone and leverage and how the wind was like water and would always find the path of least resistance. He taught them that true strength wasn't about standing tall, but about knowing when and how to bend. Clara passed first, leaving a void in the stone house that even its thick walls could not fill. Elias lived on for 5 more years, a quiet custodian of their shared memory. He died in his sleep, sitting in his chair by the fire, on the 58th anniversary of the Great Blizzard. The entire city of Prairie Ridge turned out for his funeral. They buried him on the hill, next to the simple fieldstone that marked Boro's grave. His own headstone was cut from the same gray granite he had quarried as a young man. The town council had proposed a long, laudatory epitaph, listing his deeds and calling him the town's savior. His children, knowing their father, refused. The stone bore only his name, the dates of his life, and a simple 7-word inscription that captured the essence of the man and his legacy. Elias Thorne, 1868 to 1946. He built with stone. He built for the wind. The shelter still stands. It has survived more than a century of prairie winters, a low, gray mound on the side of the hill, as much a part of the earth as the granite bedrock beneath it. Tourists sometimes visit, marveling at its construction, at the sheer stubbornness of the man who built it. But its true legacy is not in the stone walls themselves. It is in the city that surrounds it, a city that learned a hard lesson about the difference between pride and wisdom. And on winter nights, when the wind howls down from the north, a new generation of children sleep soundly in their beds, protected by the quiet knowledge of a man who listened to the wind and chose not to fight it, but to build a fortress of silence in its heart.